there is something happening around you right now that you may be completely unaware of. Somewhere in your daily life, there could be a woman who has already decided that she likes you. Not maybe, not possibly. She has already reached that conclusion in her own mind. And the strange part is that she might have reached it long before you even started wondering whether she was interested. Most men imagine attraction as something that begins when they make a move. They think the story starts when they ask a woman out, when they say something charming, or when they finally gather enough courage to express their interest. But in many cases, the story actually begins much earlier, and it begins in her mind. Long before a man decides whether he likes a woman, she has often already been quietly evaluating him. She has been observing how he speaks, how he behaves around other people, how he reacts in certain situations. She notices the small things most men assume nobody is paying attention to. And while all of this is happening, she is forming a picture of what it might be like to be close to him. This is where many men misunderstand the dynamic between attraction and awareness. A woman rarely announces her interest in obvious ways. Instead, she communicates it through behavior, subtle patterns, and emotional signals that are easy to miss if you do not know what you are looking for. That is why so many men have experienced a strange moment, months or even years later, when they suddenly realize something that once seemed impossible. They look back at a woman from their past and think, wait, was she actually into me? Sometimes the realization comes when someone else points it out. Sometimes it appears later during a random conversation with a friend. And sometimes it happens when the opportunity has already passed and the woman has moved on. The difficult part about this situation is that the signals were there all along. They simply did not look like what most men expected. Attraction is not always loud. In fact, it is often quiet. It shows itself in small decisions, repeated actions, and subtle emotional investments that might seem ordinary if you do not recognize their meaning. A woman who feels drawn to a man does not always express it through direct statements. Instead, she begins to shape her behavior in ways that create opportunities for connection. She makes room for him in her attention, in her time, and sometimes even in her imagination. From the outside, these actions can appear harmless or even accidental. But when you understand the patterns behind them, they start to look very different. What once appeared to be coincidence becomes intention. What once looked like friendliness begins to reveal a deeper interest. And once you learn to recognize these patterns, you start seeing them everywhere. The truth is that many men walk past potential relationships simply because they never realized a woman had already opened the door. And the purpose of this conversation is to make sure that does not keep happening. Because once you understand the language behind these signals, you begin to see something most men completely miss. If you want to understand why so many men miss these signals, you first need to understand something important about how attraction actually begins. The common belief is that men initiate romance while women simply respond. Movies, television, and even traditional dating advice have repeated this idea for decades. The image most people grow up with is that a man approaches. A man makes the first move and a woman either accepts or rejects him. But real human behavior tells a very different story. When researchers began studying how relationships actually start, they discovered that the majority of romantic interactions are not triggered by direct approaches at all. Instead, they begin with subtle invitations. These invitations are rarely verbal, and they often appear so ordinary that the person receiving them does not even realize what is happening. Several behavioral studies have shown that women frequently initiate romantic interaction through nonverbal signals long before a man ever thinks he is taking the lead. The signals may involve body language, attention patterns, or repeated presence in the same space. The key idea here is that attraction often begins as a silent process. A woman might notice a man in her environment and begin evaluating him without him realizing it. She watches how he treats people. She listens to the way he speaks. She notices whether he seems calm, confident, respectful, or emotionally steady. These observations help her decide whether he is someone she wants to know more about. During this stage, she is not necessarily planning a relationship yet. What she is doing is running what psychologists sometimes describe as a mental simulation. She imagines how it might feel to spend time with him, what conversations with him might be like, or how he might fit into her world. All of this can happen without a single romantic conversation, and that is why the signals that follow are often misunderstood. Once her mind begins leaning toward interest, her behavior shifts in small ways. She begins paying more attention to him than she does to others around her. She might notice details about him that she would normally ignore. She might remember things he said days or even weeks earlier. She might even begin arranging situations that increase the chances of interacting with him. None of this feels dramatic from the outside. It feels normal. It feels casual. Sometimes it even feels accidental. But from a psychological perspective, it is the beginning of attraction expressing itself through behavior. This is where the confusion begins for many men, because while she is sending signals, he may still be trying to figure out whether she even notices him. He might assume she is simply being polite, friendly, or sociable. Meanwhile, she is often waiting to see whether he will recognize the opportunity she is quietly presenting. This difference in perception creates one of the most common misunderstandings in dating. From his perspective, nothing obvious has happened yet. From her perspective, she has already shown interest several times and is waiting to see whether he will respond. Understanding this difference changes everything, because once you recognize that attraction often begins with silent signals rather than direct statements, you start paying attention to the behaviors that reveal what someone is actually feeling. And when you begin noticing those behaviors, you realize that the story of who initiates romance is not nearly as simple as most people believe. There is another part of this dynamic that many men never realize until it is too late. Attraction does not stay in the same place forever. When a woman begins signaling interest, she is not planning to send those signals indefinitely. There is often an invisible window of time where she is hoping the man she is interested in will notice and respond. If nothing happens during that time, something interesting begins to shift inside her mind. At first, she might assume you simply have not noticed yet. She might give you a little more time. She might even increase the clarity of her signals slightly. She might start conversations more often, laugh more easily around you, or place herself near you more frequently. But if the response never comes, her brain begins to interpret the silence differently. Instead of thinking maybe he hasn't noticed yet, she may start thinking maybe he isn't interested. And once that interpretation forms, her behavior slowly begins to change. This is something psychologists often refer to as emotional self-protection. When someone feels they may be investing attention in a person who does not return that interest, the mind begins creating distance as a way to avoid rejection or embarrassment. In practical terms, this means she may stop placing herself around you as often. She may stop initiating conversations. The playful attention she once gave you becomes neutral again. Eventually, she convinces herself that the interest she once felt was a mistake. From your perspective, it might look like nothing happened. From her perspective, an entire emotional story took place that you never saw. And that is why so many men later find themselves confused when they hear that a woman they once knew had feelings for them. They remember the friendly conversations and the shared moments, but never realize those moments carried deeper meaning. By the time they recognize it, the opportunity has often passed. This is exactly why learning to read these signals matters. Because when you understand how attraction is expressed through behavior, you start seeing patterns that once looked invisible. By the way, if you're new here, my name is Isabella. On this channel, we talk about the psychology behind relationships, attraction, and the subtle signals people use to communicate interest without saying the words directly. And today we are looking at 4 of the clearest signals a woman gives when she has already made up her mind about a man. These are not vague hints or confusing mixed messages. They are consistent behavioral patterns that show up again and again in real interactions. Once you learn to recognize them, you begin to see them everywhere. And the first sign is one that many men experience but completely misunderstand when it happens. Because when a woman is interested in you, one of the earliest things she begins to do is something that looks almost accidental on the surface. But once you understand the psychology behind it, it becomes impossible to miss. The first sign that a woman has already chosen you is something that looks completely ordinary at first. In fact, most men dismiss it immediately because it does not feel dramatic or romantic. It simply feels like coincidence. She keeps showing up around you not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And the reasons she gives for being there often seem logical on the surface. Yet, when you step back and really look at the pattern, the situation starts to feel a little strange. Because the truth is, her presence near you does not always make practical sense. Think about how people normally move through their day. Most of us choose the fastest route, the easiest option, and the path that requires the least effort. Human beings naturally try to conserve energy whenever possible. If something requires extra effort without a clear benefit, we usually avoid it. That is why repeated proximity can reveal something important. When a woman begins appearing around you in situations where she does not technically need to be there, it is often a signal that your presence has become emotionally valuable to her. Being near you feels rewarding enough that the inconvenience does not matter. This might look like small things at first. She suddenly chooses the same lunch area where you usually sit, even though there are several other places she could go. She walks past your workspace more often than necessary. She joins conversations you are part of even when she does not have a direct reason to participate. Sometimes she even creates a reason to talk to you. She might ask a question that could easily be answered somewhere else. She might bring up something small just to start a conversation. On the surface, it appears harmless, even random, but when the same pattern repeats again and again, the explanation becomes clearer. She is choosing proximity. Behavioral researchers who study attraction often observe what is called proximity-seeking behavior. When someone feels drawn to another person, their brain naturally encourages them to reduce physical distance. Being closer increases the chance of interaction, and interaction increases the chance of emotional connection. The interesting part is that many people do not consciously plan this behavior. A woman might genuinely believe she simply enjoys the environment where you happen to be. She might tell herself she likes the coffee machine on your floor or prefers the hallway where your office is located. Her mind provides perfectly reasonable explanations. But beneath those explanations, her behavior is still guided by attraction. And that is why this sign often confuses men. From your perspective, she might simply appear friendly or social. From her perspective, she is creating opportunities for you to notice her presence and start a conversation. It is a subtle invitation, not a demand, not an obvious move, but an opening. And once you begin paying attention to patterns like this, you start recognizing when someone's presence in your world is not random at all. It is intentional, even if the intention is never spoken out loud. Now, here is the part most men completely misunderstand about that first sign. They assume that if a woman keeps showing up around them, it must just be coincidence. After all, people work in the same places, visit the same cafes, share the same social circles. It is easy to explain away repeated encounters as random overlap. But when researchers began studying human attraction in real environments, they discovered something fascinating. People who feel drawn to someone rarely stay neutral in physical space. Instead, they unconsciously adjust their movement patterns in order to increase the chance of contact. This behavior appears across workplaces, social events, university campuses, and even casual everyday. When attraction is present, distance slowly begins to shrink. Psychologists call this proximity seeking. The concept is simple. When someone becomes emotionally interested in another person, their brain begins nudging them towards situations where interaction could happen naturally. They do not always plan it consciously. Often, it simply feels like a harmless decision in the moment. Maybe she chooses the seat closer to you during a meeting instead of the empty seat across the room. Maybe she walks past your desk even though there is another hallway that would get her to the same place faster. Maybe she finds reasons to join conversations where you are already present. Each individual action looks ordinary, but the pattern behind those actions tells a different story. When you start noticing the same person appearing in your environment again and again without a clear reason, the brain should begin asking a simple question. Why here? And why this often? Because human beings rarely waste time and energy unless something matters to them. This does not mean she is calculating every movement like a strategy. Attraction is rarely that deliberate. What usually happens is far more instinctive. Being near someone we like simply feels good. It creates anticipation, curiosity, and a small emotional reward every time we interact. That reward encourages repetition, and over time repetition creates opportunity. This is why the first sign becomes clearer the longer it continues. A single coincidence means nothing. Two coincidences might still be random, but when a woman repeatedly chooses spaces where interaction with you becomes possible, the explanation begins to shift. It is no longer just coincidence, it is attention. Another detail many men overlook is that these moments often come with subtle invitations. When she appears near you, she may glance in your direction slightly longer than necessary. She may pause long enough to create space for conversation. Sometimes, she might even make a small comment simply to open the door for interaction. She is not forcing the situation. She is creating an opportunity. And in many cases, she is watching to see if you step into that opportunity because from her perspective, she has already moved closer. She has already shown interest in the safest way she knows how. The next step in her mind often belongs to you. But proximity is only the beginning because the second sign she gives you is much harder to explain away as coincidence once you see it happen. The second sign a woman has already chosen you is something that often surprises men because it appears so simple on the surface. It does not look dramatic. It does not look flirtatious. In fact, many men interpret it as nothing more than politeness. But once you understand the psychology behind it, it becomes one of the clearest signals you will ever see. She remembers small details about you that even you forgot sharing. Think about how human memory normally works. Every day we hear hundreds of pieces of information from different people. Most of those details disappear almost immediately because the brain filters out anything it considers unimportant. This is not a flaw in our memory system. It is actually how the brain protects itself from overload. We remember what matters to us emotionally. Everything else fades away. That is why this sign is so powerful. When a woman recalls something small that you mentioned casually days or even weeks earlier, she is revealing something about how her brain has categorized you. You are no longer background noise in her environment. You have become someone her mind considers important. Imagine a simple scenario. You mentioned in passing that you have a doctor's appointment coming up next week. It is one sentence in the middle of a conversation about something completely unrelated. You probably forget about that moment almost immediately. Then a week later, she asks, "How did your appointment go?" That moment should make you pause, because remembering something like that requires attention, and attention requires emotional interest. Without that interest, the brain simply does not store the information long enough to recall it later. Psychologists studying early-stage attraction often observe a pattern called selective attention. When someone becomes emotionally interested in another person, their brain begins prioritizing information connected to that individual. Details that would normally fade away suddenly become memorable. Your hobbies become memorable. Your favorite foods become memorable. Your schedule becomes memorable. Even random comments you make during casual conversations become memorable. This is not something she is doing as a strategy. Most of the time, she's not even aware that she is doing it. Her brain has simply decided that information about you is worth saving. And that decision changes the way she listens when you speak. Instead of half hearing your words the way people usually do in casual conversation, she is absorbing them. She is storing them. She is connecting them to future moments when she might bring them up again. From your perspective, this may feel like she is simply being attentive or thoughtful. From a psychological perspective, it is something deeper. Her attention is focused on you in a way that goes beyond ordinary interaction. And when someone consistently remembers the small details of your life, it means your presence has already taken up space in their mind. But this sign, powerful as it is, still involves quiet observation. The third sign is where things start becoming harder to hide because it reveals how she reacts when something threatens the attention she has already given you. The third sign that a woman has already chosen you often appears when another woman enters the picture. And this is where things become interesting because the reaction is rarely loud or dramatic. In fact, it is usually so subtle that many men overlook it completely. What you're looking for is a small shift in her behavior when she senses potential competition. Everything might seem normal at first. She is relaxed, easygoing, and comfortable around you. Conversations flow naturally. She behaves exactly the way she always does. Then another woman shows interest in you. Maybe a coworker stops by your desk and laughs a little too easily at your jokes. Maybe a female friend hugs you warmly when she arrives somewhere. Maybe you casually mention another woman during a conversation and suddenly something changes. It might only last a few seconds. Her posture adjusts slightly. Her tone becomes a little more focused. She begins paying closer attention to what is happening around you. Sometimes she moves physically closer to you without realizing it. These reactions are often so subtle that they can easily be mistaken for nothing. But from a psychological perspective, they reveal something important. When a woman has already developed emotional interest in a man, her brain begins treating his attention as something valuable. Attention becomes a resource. And whenever a resource appears to be threatened, the brain responds instinctively. This response is not necessarily jealousy in the dramatic sense people often imagine. It is usually much quieter than that. It might show up as curiosity. She might ask a question that sounds casual but carries deeper meaning. Something like, "How do you know her?" Or, "Is she someone you work with?" The words themselves sound harmless, but the timing and tone behind them often reveal that she is gathering information. Another common reaction is a sudden increase in engagement. If another woman begins interacting with you, the woman who is interested may suddenly become more present in the conversation. She might contribute more actively. She might touch your arm while speaking or laugh more openly than usual. These behaviors are not always conscious decisions. They often come from a part of the brain that reacts instinctively to perceived competition. Anthropologists and relationship researchers have long observed this pattern. When people form an emotional preference for someone, even in the early stages, they naturally become more attentive when another potential partner appears nearby. It is a quiet way of saying without words, "I am here." And the fascinating part is that many women will later deny doing this at all, not because they are being dishonest, but because they were not consciously aware of it. The reaction happened automatically. Their mind had already categorized you as someone important. So when the possibility of losing your attention appeared even briefly, their behavior adjusted in response. When you begin noticing this pattern, it becomes very difficult to ignore because it reveals something that friendliness alone rarely produces. It reveals emotional investment. To really understand why that reaction happens, you need to look at what attraction does inside the brain. Because when a woman begins developing feelings for someone, her mind does not treat that person the same way it treats everyone else in her environment. Something shifts neurologically. Researchers who study romantic attraction have found that the brain begins activating several systems at once. The reward system becomes more sensitive to that person's presence. The motivation system encourages attention toward them. And surprisingly, another system begins to wake up as well. One connected to protection and competition. This is not something people consciously decide to do. It is part of how human bonding works. When someone becomes emotionally important to us, our brain starts treating their attention as valuable. Not in a selfish or possessive way, but in a protective way. The mind begins to monitor situations where that attention might shift towards someone else. And this is where subtle competition behavior can appear. It does not look like the exaggerated jealousy you sometimes see in movies. Instead, it shows up in small behavioral adjustments. A woman might suddenly become more attentive during a conversation. If another woman enters the interaction, she may begin engaging more actively, asking questions, maintaining stronger eye contact, or positioning herself physically closer to you. The interesting part is that these changes often disappear as quickly as they appeared. Once the perceived competition is gone, she returns to her usual relaxed behavior. This is why the moment can feel confusing if you are not paying attention. From your perspective, it might seem like she suddenly became more engaged and then just as suddenly relaxed again. But from a psychological standpoint, her brain was briefly responding to a situation where the attention she values could have shifted elsewhere. Anthropologists who study mating behavior across cultures often observe the same pattern. When attraction is present, people become more aware of potential rivals, even if they never openly acknowledge it. And again, this reaction is rarely deliberate. Most women are not thinking, "I need to compete right now." Their behavior simply adjusts automatically in response to the emotional value they have already placed on you. In fact, if you later asked her why she suddenly became more involved in the conversation, she might give you a completely logical explanation. She might say she just found the topic interesting or felt like contributing more in that moment. But the timing of the behavior often reveals something deeper. It's usually agreed upon that being the predator is a far better deal than being the prey. And this is something that we generally see as a rule, not just now, but also when you travel back in time and take a peek at various prehistoric groups of animals. Mammals, birds, fish, you name it. It seems like it's the predators that are always on top and the creatures you really don't want to mess with. Of course, though, this does make some practical sense as predators must evolve to be deadlier in order to eat and defend their territories, or they simply would stop to exist. In one group we see this rule in full power is the dinosaurs. As when people think of the mightiest or deadliest of all prehistoric predators, we usually do think of this iconic bunch, especially if you limit the options to land only. Sorry, Meg. And across their reign we saw the evolution of raptors, tyrannosaurs, ceratosaurs, spinosaurids, and many more. With each group cooking up some pretty monstrous creations, including the largest predators to ever walk. However, here's the thing. As the predatorial dinosaurs were getting deadlier, so were the herbivorous counterparts in their own ways. 'Cause I mean, who wants to get eaten without putting up a fight? And thus, through the age of dinosaurs, we see an epic arms race develop between both sides, giving rise to the likes of ceratopsids with their deadly horns, stegosaurs with their spiked tails, sauropods with their men's size, and the list goes on. And while these groups as a whole are fearsome and metal, the predators that lived alongside them still efficiently kept up, retaining the ability to hunt these lot to the very end. Although with that said, once in a blue moon, a herbivorous dinosaur would come along that was simply too much to handle and went against the usual rules, sticking out amongst their own kind like some sort of biological terminator, becoming in some ways even more metal and deadly than the predators which roamed alongside them and even dreamt to eat them. And one of the more premier examples of this has to do with an already pretty overpowered group, the sauropods. On average, these guys are arguably already the hardest of any dinosaur to take out, thanks to their immense size, which in many cases alone was enough, because who's stupid to take on animals that could be heavier than a freaking tank? And thanks to their size, their bodies themselves could be wielded as weapons, with the feet being crushers, necks, a battering ram, and in some cases, their tails an industrial whip. as seen for example in the Dodicus, with some studies estimating that they could be swung fast enough to break the speed of sound, and that is crazy. And all, but there was a sauropod that took things to a whole another level, becoming something of a hybrid between a sauropod and ankylosaur. Which is not a great combo for the predators, let's say, and it ended up evolving a clubtail of all things, and its name was Shonosaurus. 161 to 157 million years ago, the late Jurassic was in full swing, and while you may know a lot about North America during this time in the infamous Morris Information, there was a lot going on around the world too, especially in China, where in light of its much closer proximity to North America than now, it too had become a bit like the Morris Information, meaning lots of ornithischians and predators, with up to 12 carnivorous theropods alone being found in singular environments such as the Shishima Formation. These carnivores greatly ranged in size, with numerous being smaller and medium-sized. Well, then there were a few giants such as the Sinraptor and the Yangchuanosaurus, two dinosaurs capable of being over 1 ton. And in the case of the latter, it was even possible for it to reach in excess of 3 tons. Understandably, these predators put immense pressure on the herbivores, whilst a large number of stegosaurs and sauropods in the lands then went on to create their own competition amongst themselves, and thus, in conclusion, knew how to be incredibly tough to survive. And the Shununosaurus achieved this in its very own unique way. You see, it wasn't the biggest sauropod around, with individuals weighing about 3 tons and measuring 11 meters or 36 feet long. But where it was able to take things to a whole another level was, like I said, at the end of its long muscular tail. You see, just like certain ankylosaurs, this sauropod had unlocked the ability to evolve a full-on wrecking ball, having a big old chunk of bony material that sat at the end of it, forming a club that was about the size of your entire head. And let me tell you, this wasn't just some simple smooth club either, because taking a page out of the Stegosaur book, the Shunosaurus had also developed spikes on these clubs that were formed by cone-shaped osteoderms, which sat on top of the structure, with each spike measuring at least 2 inches or 5 centimeters, and were possibly longer in life as fossils not only were, but also because these spikes might have been covered in creatinous sheaths. And so, essentially given the sauropod a spiked club that formed a one-of-a-kind weapon. And so, in conjunction with its relatively long tail, this beast would have been able to whip this weapon around with horrifying speeds, generating more than enough energy to pulverize the bones of large predators. While the spikes then would have concentrated the forces, creating oversized holes in anything unlucky enough or dumb enough to get in the way of one of these guys. And given their height, strikes would not have just meant a sore leg, rather a lethal shot to the torso, neck, or head that would have cracked open like a coconut. But let's just say there would not be any coconut water coming out. More of a surely temple. Additionally, in another rejection of the normal rules, the Shunosaurus had a shorter neck, meaning that it did not graze higher trees like its related kin, but instead grazed upon low-down trees and plants, which were typically coarser. And this fact has led to a possible backup weapon. As compared to other sauropods, its teeth were unique in robustness and shape, almost forming the same shape as a garden shear, allowing it to obviously snip off tough plants, but then also perhaps giving it the ability to administer painful love bites when needed. Because for analogy's sake, while garden shears are designed for plants, they can deal some nasty damage to flesh too. And this was only further backed by its skull shape, which tended to be compact, broad, shortened, and deep, meaning they could take a surprising amount of stress when clamping down, which could be used to bite through copious amounts of thick plant material, or perhaps again, bite through another type of material. Yet, with that said, given that they had their highly effective and long tails that can maneuver around large parts of their body, I think it's safe to say that they usually just defaulted to, well, their tail. And clearly, this built-in weapon worked quite nicely for the sauropod, as the Shunosaurus survived for millions of years in an environment where toughness was a baseline requirement, not an exception. Yet I dare say that not even a club-tailed sauropod is as metal as another herbivorous dinosaur that happened to be alive at the exact same time, only living in a different part of the world, living in a place which would one day become Morocco, the Spikeles. Now, this was a medium-sized dinosaur that was one of the earlier ankylosaurians that we are aware of. The ankylosaurs, as you know, was a pretty unusual group in general already, being known for their exotic and sometimes extensive armor, as well as, of course, their tails, which could be clubbed or take on various other deadly shapes. And of all the members, you very likely know the Ankylosaurus, a possibly 8-ton armored tank with a wickedly large club to match. And while the Spiomeles was related to this absolute icon, it did not have a club. Instead, this dinosaur is something you'd expect to see in a stegosaur. In other words, a phagomizer-like structure. You see, at the end of its tail, it possessed ospi tendons as well as hardened bone, which was elongated and sharpened, forming multiple spike-like objects that in turn formed a very wicked tail weapon. Now, an ichthyosaur with a spiked tail is already unique and metal. But here's the thing, the Spikeles had more spikes than just the ones on his tail. In fact, based on our covered material, it seems that the entire body was likely covered in these spikes, creating an armored ensia that was also like an oversized porcupine in some ways. And what was even weirder is that on top of having dozens of sharp spikes, said spikes also highly varied in size. Some were smaller, relatively speaking, that is, while the largest and most complete ones were about 87 centimeters or 34 inches long, so the length of nearly 3 rulers stacked together. And together, these spikes on its bodies made the spike of Meles one of the most interesting dinosaurs to have ever lived in a herbivore that would be exceedingly hard for predator to take down. I mean, where exactly are you going to bite this thing? Not to mention that during any predation attempt, it would likely be using its tail too, making attacks from any direction quite possible. And so, really, when you add all this together, you pretty much get an animal that you could only kill if you tip it over, and that would be quite challenging in itself. Not only because it would probably do its best to prevent this, but also because it was fairly heavy for its visual size, weighing about 2 tons thanks to its numerous spikes and the armor underneath, which only gave it that much more defense on top of it. And suffice to say, this overkill level of self-defense, no pun intended, did help to keep the Spikeles safe from hungry mouths. As within its environment we know that various megalosaurids and allosaurs are present, while then the waterways are infested with multiple kinds of crocodilorphs. And yet, even with this challenging environment, our spiky boy prevailed for over 7 million years. And what's interesting is that as of now, the spiky mouse is actually the oldest known definitively named ankylosaur. And as such, it was clearly a big part of ankylosaur evolution, being on top of this, the oldest verified known member with a tail weapon. And thus, not only did its design keep it safe, but it was also probably a larger reason why ichthyosaurs were able to get a better foot in the door and further evolve in a world already filled with threats and competition. And their strange design proved so effective that, like I said, they didn't really need overall size to scare off predators, even though from a width and length standpoint, they weren't exactly that big. And we do see this with yet another animal that also went the spiky route instead of size, and in some ways, took things to an even further level than Spikeles essentially becoming a full-fledged real-life porcupine dinosaur. And this would be the how long. Keeping in line with an apparent trend, this odd dinosaur lived in Mesozoic China during the early Cretaceous period, some 125 million years ago. It was an ornithischian that was some type of hydrosauroid. And though it wasn't closely related, it did share somewhat of a resemblance with an iguanodon in general. It's along with a similar superficial shape. It also had those elongated, iconic spiked thumbs that are thought to have possibly operated like stiletto weapons, being able to puncture and slice things. But here's the thing. How long was unlike the iguanodon when it came to size, for it was a smaller dino? Now, this said, the only nearly complete specimen we have is just a juvenile, So we can't say for sure how big they grew. But based on related dinosaurs in the area, it's believed that adults are about half the length of an iguanodon and much lighter. Still though, this more diminutive size in addition to the thumbs would have let it protect itself from most of the predators in its environments, which included the Charistater and smaller tyrannosaurs like the dong and raptors, plus various transandromas. But then there were larger predators like the Eutyrannus, which definitely grew to a lethal size for the how long, reaching up to 9 meters or nearly 30 feet and weighing over 1 ton. And so at this size, even adult how long would have been a prime target for the Eutyrannus. But to get around this rather tricky, life-threatening ordeal, the how long developed structures never seen before in a dinosaur, and that would be quills. To be exact, when the original specimen was unearthed, paleontologists noted that there were hollow keratinous spines that covered its entire body and were preserved down to the nuclear level. And these things highly differed from the protofeathers seen in theropods and spines of living squamates. Instead, showing a high similarity to the quills seen in modern porcupines, leading to the conclusion that this was in fact a quill dinosaur. And I don't think I need to tell you that quills have been quite effective for porcupines, allowing them to be rather safe from predators that would otherwise have a field day with them. And paleontologists think this was a similar case with the how long, where the quills would act as a defensive shield against any sharp teeth looking for a bite. And just like the unrelated modern porcupines, the how long's quills varied in length and width, with the smallest ones being rather short and narrow, while the largest were thickened and up to 2 inches long. But again, because of fossilization in life, they were likely even longer. Now, there is one mystery about this oddball though, and it's relating to the quills again, because we only have juvenile specimens, and therefore paleontologists aren't 100% sure that adults actually retain the quills that they had while young. But if they did, it then also leads to another question of how long they grew and matured individuals. As if they did grow proportionally, then we could possibly be talking about an ornithopod covered in hundreds or perhaps even thousands of knife-length quills that would make just about any predation attempt on this dinosaur a rather self-destructive choice. And again, not to be the dead horse, but this is relating to an animal that wasn't exactly a giant by dinosaur standards. However, as we see in the sauropods, size was always a classic fallback that could do the trick. And while many non-sauropod dinosaurs were large as well, it was usually just the long necks which were at the size the predators were fully deterred. Whereas on the flip side, if you got rid of the defenses of an Ankylosaurus or the spikes on a Triceratops, you'd probably have seen them join the local buffet. This said though, there was a subtle group of dinosaurs that actually, like the sauropods, used size to their advantage. However, unlike the former, this group didn't always use size, and it was really only a couple that pushed things to the absurd, becoming in fact the largest dinosaurs of all time that were not sauropods. And this would be the hadrosaurs. On paper, your typical hadrosaur was not really, let's say that metal compared to other groups. They did not have any noticeable weapons or armor, and they generally weighed between 2 to 4 tons, making them larger than the median dinosaur, but nothing too crazy. However, like I alluded to, a few would end up evolving into absolute giants, making them one of the last things a predator would dare to take on. And for many years, the prime example of this was the Shantungosaurus. And this guy also happens to be our first late Cretaceous animal in the video, existing within China once more about 77 million years ago. If you drew this creature on paper, it would look like a fairly normal hadrosaur, having possessed a pretty standard body shape with no clear distinguishing features that set it apart from other hadrosaurs within his tribe of the Admasauri. Yet, if you were to see an adult in person, you'd quickly realize this guy wasn't standard by any hadrosaur means, as it was essentially a living, breathing kaiju. Based off remains, it's estimated that these guys would have measured a whopping 56 feet or 17 meters from snout to tail, while then weighing up to 18 tons and possibly more, and thus also making it even larger than the likes of the Tyrannosaurus rex. And also, just in general, one of the largest animals on the entire continent at the time. And so, undoubtedly, such immense size made this one you really did not want to mess with. And interestingly, just like horses, it's thought that had kicked. Let me tell you, I don't think you're walking away from a kick from this guy. And honestly, a kick is not the only thing you'd have to worry about, because just this thing walking, let alone running, would sort of be like a moving freight train. And so, understandably, for the most part, the vast majority of predators in the area can only dream of taking down an adult. Only the Zhuchang tyrannus, a tyrannosaur, came anything close to its size, measuring about 10 meters or 33 feet in length and weighing 5 metric tons. Yet even that is quite a bit smaller than the Shantungosaurus. So a lone Zhuchang tyrannus trying to take one down seems like a bit of a stretch. And that's not even factoring in the fact that there is strong evidence that this hadrosaur roamed in groups, improving obviously their collective defense. And then on top of this guy in recent years, another hadrosaur that is seemingly turning out to be more and more of a freak when it comes to size was a fellow Edmontosaurini and actually the flagship member, the Edmontosaurus, who also existed during the late Cretaceous, but was instead found in North America. In general, the Edmontosaurus is already a rather large, measuring up to 12 meters or 39 feet and weighing multiple metric tons. So, this is massive already. Yet, the Edmontosaurus has also been known to yield some specimens that were straight-up freaks of nature, suggesting that they might have pushed this stat a bit more. Specifically, the largest fossils found suggest that giant adults could have hit 15 meters or 49 feet and weighed up to nearly 16 metric tons, which if the case would be quite a non-insignificant size boost. And then, on top of this, there is even one partial specimen where the tail alone, which is, by the way, actually the whole specimen, is over 7.5 meters or 25 feet long, which for perspective is almost twice the height of a giraffe. And again, that is just the tail. And this fossil is thought to have maybe belonged to an individual that weighed about 18 tons, so akin to that of the Shantungosaurus. And as much as I love the T-Rex, I don't think the king is trying to mess with something that big. And perhaps now is a good time to also mention that the Edmontosaurus and the Shantungosaurus's tail could have possibly been a secret weapon, as well as it seems that the tendons when their tails were heavily oified, meaning tissue that is hardened and likely served as anchors for massive powerful muscles. Something that would have made the tails a bit like a living brick wall, except a brick wall that could be swung. And something tells me that a massive rod of muscle, bone, and flesh, almost twice the size of a giraffe, would deal quite some serious damage even to large predators. And clearly, this giant size boost seems to have been a pretty OP move for the hadrosaurs, as giant hadrosaurs were a thriving bunch all the way up to the KT extinction event. So who knows what would have happened if they had survived and kept on evolving. Of course, while all these herbivores are amazing, one cannot forget to pay homage to the Mount Rushmore of metal herbivorous dinosaurs, and that would undoubtedly be the Triceratops, Ankylosaurus, and Stegosaurus. Interestingly, all three of these guys were ornithischians who all shared a common theme, which was that they existed in a realm of absolute constant danger. For the Ankylosaurus and the Triceratops, both lived alongside the literal largest terrestrial predator that we know of, the T-Rex. While then the Stegosaurus lived within the Morrison Formation, perhaps the most infamous environment of the entire Jurassic, with plenty of different predators to pick from. So with all this unusual amount of danger, each evolved to be freaks of nature amongst their own families. And it seems that part of this formula included a sprinkle of gigantism, as all three are considered to be the largest, or basically the largest members of their entire families, with the Ankylosaurus weighing 8 tons, the Stegosaurus 5 tons, and the Triceratops between 6 and 10 tons, depending on who you ask. And therefore, we are already talking about absolute units. But then on top of this, each of the three had evolved some pretty one-of-a-kind defenses and armor. The Ankylosaurus had the trademarked osteoderms, which covered extensive parts of its body, and also possessed the largest known club of any known ankylosaur, which could be swung, by the way, with enough power to pulverize bones, making any predation attempt a rather smooth brain move. And while this does not mean anything in full certainty, it is also interesting that the Ankylosaurus is the only known large herbivore from the Hell Creek Formation that is yet to be found with any damage coming from a T-Rex, showing that even the king was wary of this herbivorous nightmare. Then on the flip side, you had the Triceratops, who is the only known dinosaur so far to have conclusively injured a Rex based on the very well-known dueling dinosaur specimen. And it was able to achieve this thanks to its very own OP build, which included a massive bony frill on its head that acted as a protective cover, not just for its face, but its more vulnerable neck area as well. Then sitting on top of this protection, the Triceratops had the crowning achievement of the Cereratopsids, a wicked set of sharp horns that in its case came in three, with the two top ones being significantly longer than the bottom. These lethal guys are made of a bony cores and then covered in a thick chitinous sheath, meaning that in life they were longer than what you see in the museums. And that is saying a lot, seeing that the largest recorded spikes coming from a specimen dubbed Yoshi's Trike, and no, I'm not kidding, are already 115 centimeters or nearly 3.8 feet long. So in other words, long enough that in most cars, if you were sitting in the passenger seat, you would still get skewered if a Triceratops stuck its horn through the driver's window. Then, contrary to what many believe, the horns in life were curved, not straight, which actually made them a bit more nasty to get hit by, as the curved nature would have caused more messy wounds and larger wound channels that would increase bleeding and increase infection risk if he managed to survive, with due emphasis on the if part. Plus, because of this curvature, the Triceratops had good leverage to then, if it wanted to, buck its head back and either tip or throw whatever unfortunate animal into the air, kind of like what we see in modern-day bulls. And then last, but by no means least, there was the Stegosaurus, who had its infamous stagomizer at the end of its large muscular tail. Like the Triceratops, the four defensive spikes were made up of a solid bony core, which was then covered by again a chitinous sheath, making the spikes longer, and you guessed it, sharper. Based on one study, it was estimated that using its muscles, the Stegosaurus could swing its tail with enough power to generate about 35 kilos of force, which at first doesn't sound like a whole lot, but you have to remember that all this pressure was concentrated on the tips of the spikes. And therefore, they were generating pressures more than 1,000 times greater than the atmosphere at sea level, which in non-scientific terms means that it was more than enough to punch clean holes straight through flesh, muscles, organs, and get this, even bones. As one seriously unfortunate Allosaurus found out firsthand. You see, some years ago, an Allosaurus specimen was found with a puncture-shaped wound on what was essentially its crotch. Yeah? Ouch. And said puncture-shaped wound perfectly matched a wound, or RL, Siorseji. And what really sucked for this predator was that it didn't even die at first, which might sound mean to say, but makes a lot more sense when you realize that it suffered for an unknown duration of time before death finally took it due to the injury. And if the thagomizer wasn't enough somehow, there is a little-known secret about the Stegosaurus, which is that it was actually armored too. Well, part of it, as individuals possessed a specialized layer of neck armor known as gular armor that was made up of hundreds of small bony plates and nodules, giving it resistance to throat attacks. And with that, we come to this video's end, but not the end of the list of incredibly hardcore herbivores, because, trust me, there are plenty more to go around, but their stories are for another day. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Extinct Zoo.